Happy Monday, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are watching me from around the world, maybe today in London, England. Thank you for joining me for this week's teaching. I am Krista Bontrager, and I am a public theologian and Christian apologist. And this is the channel where I offer teaching about the Bible and theological commentary on social issues. I am live today, so I would love to hear from you in the comments if you happen to catch the live stream. If you don't, I'll turn on the comments afterward and you can let me know your thoughts or questions in the comments after the stream is over. I am excited to bring you this second teaching in a series this month that I'm doing on anti-Semitism. Who knew? This is such a big topic that it needed 3, possibly 4 discussions. It's continuing to be a national conversation, popular on social media and Christian Twitter, if you will. And again, my goal in all of this is to try to help you understand a very complicated issue in a biblical way. And that's really what I want to focus on today, is helping us get to a biblical understanding of the issues. I also want to remind you once again that I have posted a number of conversations related to the topic of Judaism, the war in Israel, Islam, and the Middle East. I've put all of those discussions together on a playlist on my channel, so you can check those out. Just go to Theology Mom on YouTube and look for the playlist about Judaism, Israel, and the Middle East. Now, in the last broadcast, I did a deep dive on the definition of anti-Semitism. We spent quite a bit of time interacting with the definition published by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And this is the one that is used by many countries, including the United States, as the standard to identify and define anti-Semitism. In this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about the complex history of anti-Semitism and then round things out with my attempt at a biblical definition of the issue. So please do like and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you're still subscribed, just in case YouTube does occasionally like to unsubscribe people. Just make sure you're still subscribed, like the broadcast, and please leave a comment. Now, last May, when I first started working on this teaching series, I sat down with my friend Callie Mitchell. She is an American living in Jerusalem, and she's married to a Messianic Jew and embedded in the Messianic Jewish community there in Israel. And she has been a wonderful dialogue partner for me on these issues. However, if I get anything wrong in this podcast, don't take it out on her. That's totally on me. I am continuing to learn and think and grow on these issues. But one of the things that Callie really helped me with was increasing my understanding of the historical events that stand behind the definition of anti-Semitism. I'm going to start off here with a short clip from the conversation we recorded last May, where we discussed my confusion over the term and how she thinks about anti-Semitism. Here it is.
I will say, though, that some of this is discussion that I've seen globally. Like right now, I'm understanding that the Germans are actually preferring to use Jew hatred because they think it's a little bit more specific.
Okay.
So, so you're not alone in kind of wanting to discuss what this word is and what does it mean, but it has a pretty extensive history. And I actually view anti-Semitism as a worldview. And so to give it a specific title, I think it helps us as believers to be able to talk about how it is antithetical to a biblical worldview, right? So it actually developed by someone who wasn't Jewish, by a German Lutheran named Wilhelm Marr in the 1840s. And this is a really important history about this word that I think a lot of people don't know, and it does start to make the use of it make a little bit more sense, I think. So he was a political activist and he started out his career with a desire to help marginalized and oppressed groups be emancipated. And so he joined a really left-wing movement in Switzerland, and he got exiled from the country and ended up in South America or Central America, in North America for a bit. And while he was there, he developed a Jew hatred somehow. I'm not sure how, but he came back to Germany with this hatred towards the Jews. And so then he turned his political movement into something that was anti-Jewish. Now, he developed this belief while he was away that the Jews were planning to take over the entire world, and that the European nations, and Germany in particular, where he was from, needed to actively stand against this plan of domination, of global world domination that the Jews had, right? So rather than focusing on the religious aspects that had been pretty paramount to Jewish persecution throughout history prior to him, he took a different angle. So the different angle that he took was that he decided to focus on race instead of religion. And since he was focusing on race, he wanted to disband the word that was being used in Germany at the time, which was Judenhass, which meant Jew hatred. So he wanted to use something that had less of a religious connection. So he drew from linguistics and took the word Semite, because Hebrew is a Semitic language. So he concluded that if Hebrew is a Semitic language, then their race must be Semites. And then he added the negative anti to it, and he developed the word anti-Semitism. And along with that, he formed a political organization called the League of Anti-Semites to promote his political ideology. So that's basically where that word started. And he had some pretty specific positions too. Like, for one, he said that if the Jews tried to assimilate, then that was paramount or equated to infiltration. Okay. So they couldn't even assimilate into the culture without having a suspicion or an accusation against them. He also said that Jewish conformity was equated to duplicity, and Jewish integration into non-Jewish society was actually proof that they were trying to dominate the world. And a religious conversion, I'm using that word, and Messianic community doesn't like the word conversion, but I'm using that in a historic sense here. So their conversion to Christianity didn't change their ethnicity. So they were still part of this collective that was trying to generate some world domination of some capacity. Now,
So let me just jump in here for a minute and kind of summarize a couple of very critical points that you made. Is that this German activist, Wilhelm Marr, and this is again from the 1840s, his coining the term anti-Semitism was for him a badge of honor. It's like saying, I am anti-Semitic. It's not a term I'm trying to avoid. It's a term I'm applying to myself, that I am anti-Semitic. Is that kind of what?
Yeah, that was how he was choosing to self-identify his worldview. And his political goals was that he was anti-Semitic, that he was doing this great thing to protect the world from Jewish world domination.
Okay. And so when you say that Jewish assimilation is ought to be seen as infiltration, what he was saying with that is that if we let Jewish people assimilate into our culture as Germans or wherever we find ourselves, that's like enemy infiltration into the culture. It's a bad thing. It's something we don't want. Or conformity as duplicity. Well, when Jewish people give the appearance of conforming to culture, they're really lying to you. It's duplicitous. And so the anti-Semitism has certain assumptions, or as you're calling it, a worldview, a lens through which they are looking at Jewish people, but also looking at Jewish motives.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Right. Because, you know, when we talk about what the definition of anti-Semitism is, you know, we just talked through a lengthy one, but if you were to really sum it up, it would be Jew hatred, and most people add Jew suspicion onto
Okay.
that. And you can see how that comes from the foundation here, the historical foundation with Mar, because he had a tremendous amount of suspicion about the Jewish people that he was perpetuating. You know, he wrote some books about this.
So then that makes me think about Hitler, because maybe about 80 years after Marr is proposing these ideas, along comes Hitler and the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. Is there a connection between those two ideas?
Yes, there's a direct link because Hitler's movement was very much about ethnic, you know, ethnicity and race. And he was trying to create this pure Aryan race, right? So he was looking at the Jewish people not through a religious perspective either, but through a racial lens. And of course, within Nazi Germany, there was also religious persecution and religious anti-Semitism. But he built his movement off of the race component. Because according to his policy, anyone that had one Jewish grandparent was Jewish, and they would go into the camps. So it definitely carried over into Nazi Germany and was part of what fueled the Nazi movement.
So then that draws me back to the original definition that we looked at earlier by the International Holocaust um, Alliance, or whatever that was, the IHRA, because I can see now how some of their examples and the components of their definition are trying to rebut Wilhelm Marr and this classical, we're going to call it the classical definition of anti-Semitism.
Yes. And at some point in Jewish discourse, anti-Semitism took on the meaning of all forms of Jewish hate, even prior to Marr.
Okay.
Because of course he used, you know, he used the traditional forms of persecution of the Jews, but he put this new modern twist on it that was focusing on the racial component. So in like scholarly discourse, anti-Semitism would be something that Jewish persecution, even in the Middle Ages, for example, would fall under.
Okay.
But the terminology was not developed by the Jewish people. It was developed by a Gentile German who had a Jew hate and a Jew suspicion.
Okay. And so I think it's important to have both of those components of the hatred and the suspicion, because those two things are unique features of anti-Semitism. And I can see now like the case for the term, and having understanding a little bit more about the history and context is helpful. So, you know, thank you for leading us through that, because it helps give more biblical, or just more worldview and historical perspective on things.
Right, because I think about it, this isn't a one-to-one example, but I think about it when we talk, like something like when we talk about Marxism, for example. Marxism is a worldview that was developed by Karl Marx, right? He was the founder, and he had other influences. And when you say something's Marxist, it might not encompass every single component of that worldview, but you might see how it's drawing from that worldview in some ways, right? So I think of anti-Semitism in a very similar way, that it's an ism, so it's a worldview. And you can see how certain aspects of that worldview may become more normalized and more accepted, whereas other parts might be thrown out, or maybe someone has adopted personally certain aspects of that worldview, but not the whole worldview in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Okay, so again, that was recorded last May with my friend Callie, and this exchange, this part of our dialogue, really helped me kind of have a deeper appreciation for the concerns that were shared by the rabbi on the Candace Owens show that I played at the beginning of part one of this series last week, and just understanding it from a Jewish perspective, you know, if for no other reason, just to understand their point of view, even if even if I disagree with it or I have an issue with how the word anti Semitism is used in today's parlance or anything of that nature, but to understand the historical context to me is a valuable exercise. It helps me to listen for the purpose of learning and, you know, maybe even empathy in on some level. But when that rabbi on the Candace Owens show gave this long soliloquy about defining anti-Semitism, when Candace asked him a very straightforward question, give me a definition, and then he proceeds to give a very short definition followed by a lot of historical storytelling about things that happened 1,000 years ago. It was very confusing. And you're thinking, what, at least I was thinking, like, what's happening right now? This answer is very peculiar. But what I have come to understand is that from the Jewish perspective, those things that happened in the Middle Ages between Catholics and Jews is really just as fresh in their collective memory and connected directly through the development of 19th century anti-Semitism to what happened in the Holocaust in the 1940s, right straight through what happened in Israel on December 7th or October 7th, 2023. So there was some, for me, at least, more understanding as a result of having this conversation with Callie. Now, I went on to ask her about some more specific examples of anti Semitic themes based on history. And she walked me through how to interpret common examples of anti Semitism through propaganda cartoons. And this was kind of interesting. So I want to play now that part of our discussion. We look at the race conversation here in the US. Historical examples that often come forward are like putting on blackface or publishing cartoons that have highly exaggerated features of Black people. And one of the things I kind of learned in our previous conversation is, there are these kind of historical equivalents of that within the Jewish community too, that there are artistic depictions, for example, that are caricatures of Jewish people, and it kind of in the parallel to what we face in the race conversation here with African Americans. So maybe walk us through the background of that, and then we have some examples to show.
Yeah. Well, within Jewish history, they do have a history of anti-Semitic cartoons emerging as a propaganda tool. And this was something that Hitler really pushed both in the schools and also in the mass media. And the caricatures in the cartoons usually would feature the Jews as having exaggerated facial features like exaggerated noses or exaggerated ears, and they might be depicted as a vampire or an octopus, things that had some sort of negative connotation in the culture. There is this concept of the devilish Jew that was often promoted in the cartoons. And they were just always, the Jewish people in these cartoons were always portrayed as villains and undesirable, sometimes attacking children, promoting that blood libel, never in a positive light. And we've seen that carried on even today. In fact, when I first moved to Israel, I discovered the link between Hamas and the Nazis because of the cartoons. I was seeing cartoons that were coming out of the Arab Palestinian population, and I was looking at them and I was thinking, why do these look so much like something that came out of Nazi Germany? And that kind of took me down that rabbit hole of doing some research on it. Because I had, when I was in graduate school, I had taken the course on anti-Semitism, and we covered anti-Semitic cartoons pretty thorough. So, I got here and I was seeing these. I was just like, why is this link happening? Like, why am I seeing this, repeating itself, basically?
And we did a deep dive on that whole connection in our previous conversation last fall. You walked us through the connection between Hamas and the Nazis, which was super eye opening for me. Now I get it and I see it in their rhetoric and everywhere. But if people want more information on that, they can go back and check out our conversation from October 2023. Let's just walk through a few of these cartoons you mentioned earlier, kind of these depictions. One of them is a vampire, depicting Jewish people as a vampire. Interpret this cartoon for me. I'm not even really sure what I'm looking at here.
Yeah, it's really creepy, isn't it?
It is creepy, yeah.
It's just creepy. This is from a Nazi publication called Der Stürmer. I'm sorry, I do not speak German. I hope I didn't offend anyone, but it means the stormer. And you can find online resources that really catalog the cartoons and the propaganda from this publication. So I just pulled this one, but here you have a Jewish man depicted as a vampire, and he's making a potion. And the caption that went with this in the journal was saying that he was giving this, I guess he would be an Aryan, and the era it was drawn, some of the potion in order to manipulate him. So this is propaganda promoting the Jewish global conspiracy concept.
And this is from the 1930s. We should probably add.
From 1930.
So the kind of the global conspiracy, which takes us back to Wilhelm Marr, that was kind of part of his worldview, anti-Semitic worldview, if you will. And so by drinking this potion, the German Aryan was being deceived by the Jewish people, is kind of playing into the duplicity of the Jewish people and that sort of a thing. Am I on the right track there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Walk us through this cartoon where we see a giant, I'm going to say gorilla on top of a globe with the Pope down at the bottom, very small.
Right. This one is actually from an Arab Muslim publication. And, it's depicting the Jewish people as a monkey, which is derogatory, of course. And it says, Jerusalem, from New York City to Kuala Lumpur, undivided, eternal capital of Israel. Everything else is negotiable. So it's again, promoting that global conspiracy theory that the Jews want, global domination. Jerusalem is undivided, but the cities that it lists here span the world, basically.
So this whole Jewish cabal kind of a thing, did that originate with this guy Wilhelm Marr? Is that where this idea comes from? Because you hear this everywhere, and we're going to get into some more of the specifics of that. But was he kind of the generator of that idea?
I don't know if he's the one who created it. I'm not sure, but I know that he was one of the main people to promote it.
Okay.
In the 1800s and the mid 19th century. But there was also a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion that was published in 1901. So, not long after Marr passed away, this book was written. And this book in particular was supposed to be a transcript, like a transcribed or like a transcription of 24 lectures from the leaders of this underground cabal. And it was, and so it promoted this idea, but in 1921, actually, the Times of London did a article on this where they showed that it was really heavily plagiarized. So it was a fictitious work and it lifted very large passages. And if you look at the article itself from the Times of London, you can see like they show in the article the passages that it lifted, but it lifted them from Maurice Joly's Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. Is that how you say Montesquieu?
Yeah, Montesquieu. Uh-huh.
Okay, Montesquieu. Yeah, and that was written in 1864. So they lifted large passages. I mean, like almost verbatim, word for word passages from this. So it's completely a fictional text. And then later on, other scholars who were reviewing it found that they also plagiarized from a Prussian novel. So it wasn't an original work. And, you know, the Machiavelli piece, they don't mention the Jews anywhere in that book. Like there's nothing about the Jewish community in that particular work. So what's interesting though is that even though this was very much a fictional book and it was proven by the Times of London to be plagiarized, and then later in a Swiss court in 1935, it was further ruled as a forgery. Even though that happened during Nazi Germany, Hitler published it in 23 different editions, and he had it taught in their school systems. And so that book was another source of this whole idea of the Jewish cabal. And it's completely fictional.
Interesting. So there is some history behind it, but it's not truth. It seems to be kind of almost like an urban legend that just keeps getting repeated over and over. But you hear this all the time now. All right, let's look at a couple more of these cartoons. The next one is about blood libel, and I'm going to have you explain. We're going to look at the cartoon and then have you explain what that is.
Okay.
Yeah. So for the podcast, for the podcast, I'm not even really sure what I'm looking at here. It almost looks like they're Jewish people grinding up body parts and then drinking blood, but I'm thinking that can't possibly be what this is. So I don't know. Maybe walk us through what is happening in this cartoon.
Not wrong.
Okay.
This is another Arab Muslim cartoon. And so it's showing Israelis and the IDF taking Palestinian children. You can tell by the scarf, you know, the child is wearing a Palestinian scarf. And they are killing them and using their blood for a drink. And so this goes back to the anti-Semitic trope of the blood libel, which was the idea that Jews made ritual sacrifices, particularly of Christian children. That was the libel of history, and used their blood to make matzah or for sacrifices in the temple historically. But that they used the blood of Christian children for religious rituals, basically. And so it's being appropriated here in a Palestinian context where now they're using the blood of the Arab children for their ritual purposes.
That's pretty gruesome.
Yes. And again, you know, this is very, very antithetical to a worldview. I mean, like, I feel like just saying that just even minimizes how gruesome it is. But obviously, blood was treated in human life even in the Torah, you know, are treated with very high regard, you know, thou shalt not kill, right? Like there's nothing within Judaism that should even suggest this idea. So the fact that it was started is just wicked. It's just evil. And so then we see it here in Arab context.
Wow. Okay. All right. Let's look at this next one of who I think is supposed to be Benjamin Netanyahu, but he has some, I don't even know what to call what his hands are supposed to be. They're almost like talons or something. And he's looking very ominous. And then the caption calls him Nozenyahu.
Right.
So walk us through the anti-Semitic nature of this cartoon.
Right. So this was actually pretty recent. This one was published since the war started, and it was published by a French-Canadian newspaper. And of course, the nose in Yahoo idea would be drawing attention to that caricature of the larger noses that you would always find in the anti-Semitic cartoons. And then you can notice his ears. He looks kind of like a vampire too. So it's touching on that whole concept again of the Jewish vampires.
Okay. Okay, so again, thanks to my friend Callie for walking us through all of that. And why am I showing you this? Why do I want you to understand some of the historical context behind the term anti-Semitism and giving you some perspective on these issues about anti-Jewish sentiment and why our Jewish friends and family see certain situations the way that they do? I want you to have understanding. I want you to be educated, just as Monique and I have done hundreds of hours of content to help people understand perspectives within the Black community about history and historical situations and Emmett Till and the just Black Wall Street and redlining, and we've talked about all of these historical things. It doesn't automatically follow from that all of those situations have bearing on what's happening today in our context, but it does provide insight into a particular cultural community and their collective history. And so when certain topics come up, you can hopefully navigate the conversation better and in an informed way. That's why I want you to understand these things. That's why we just took the last 23 minutes to look at clips and talk about these issues, because I want you to be more informed. And I think that we can look at history and have understanding and listen to learn and all of that, and to acknowledge that Christians and Jews have had some rough historical moments together. Going back to that clip with Candace Owens and Rabbi Barclay that we saw last time, we can acknowledge as Christians, hey, our two religions, our two communities have had some difficult historical moments together. And I also think it's helpful and important to keep in mind that real life is generally much more complicated than a social media meme or a propaganda cartoon, and that the offenses have not just been one direction from Christians to Jews. I'm going to play a highlight right now from Thomas Sowell's book, Migrations and Cultures, where he summarizes in brief fashion relations between Jews and Christians in medieval Europe. Now, Dr. Sowell, my humble opinion, is an American treasure. I'm really hoping, he's in his 90s now. I'm really hoping that the current president will give him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but I digress. That's a little tangent. Anyways, here he is reading from his book, Migrations and Cultures, about relationships between Jews and Christians in the medieval period.
As a literate people during the widespread ignorance of a dark age, Jews enjoyed a certain prestige among their Christian neighbors. Even Jewish peddlers brought products and ideas from a wider world to the provincial communities of early medieval Europe. Centuries of religious preaching against Jews were required to turn them into pariahs in the popular mind. Jews as artisans, peddlers, and merchants played a role in the revival of European urban communities after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Jews lived in many European cities, including Rome, Frankfurt, and Lyon. Their urban occupations included goldsmiths and physicians, and their rural occupations owners of farms and vineyards. Jews were in the entourages of aristocrats and supplied them with exotic luxuries from the East. Christians during this era socialized with Jews and dined in their homes, and many converted to Judaism, though few Jews converted to Christianity. Recognizing the dangers to Christianity and to itself as an institution in such situations, the Catholic Church counterattacked in various ways, intellectual and political. The net result was a growth of policies, laws, and practices which kept Christians and Jews apart, forbade proselytizing by Jews, and restricted or harassed them in the practice of their own religion. Ironically, these policies worked so effectively that eventually popular anti-Jewish hostility reached levels that caused a succession of popes to issue edicts against anti-Jewish violence and libels, the most infamous libel being that Jews killed Christian babies and drank their blood. In an earlier era, the same accusation had been made by pagans against the Christians.
Okay, so that, again, is just a very short clip to help illustrate, that sometimes individual Jews and individual Christians were on friendly terms. There was some movement by the Roman Catholic Church at times against Jews, but that these relationships were complicated. And historical context is important. This issue of these blood libel rumors is a big component in the collective Jewish mindset in history about their perceived rough relationship and lack of trust with us as Christians. So if we're going to witness and share the gospel with our Jewish friends and family, having some level of awareness of how deep these blood libel rumors run, and is a seed of distrust between Christians and Jews. And for them, Roman Catholics is the same thing as saying Christians. So they're not often differentiating between us as evangelicals and Roman Catholics. For them, it's all the same. Okay. All right. I'm going to play another short clip here from Thomas Sowell. And we're just going to pick it up right where we left off there. And he's going to continue to explain some of the relationships in the medieval period between Christians and Jews, but also Muslims.
Despite growing restrictions and persecutions, many Jews continued to prosper. Indeed, Jews became preeminent in international trade between Christian Europe and the Muslim lands, partly because both saw them as neutrals in the great Christian-Muslim struggles of that era, allowing them to function economically in both worlds, where Christians restricted Muslims and Muslims restricted Christians. These functions as both economic and cultural intermediaries could be carried out because the Jews of Europe had contacts with fellow Jews in North Africa and the Middle East, many of the latter also being merchants. Part of the exports from Europe to the Islamic world during this era, and for centuries to come, were European slaves. In an era when large land ownership in Europe often meant holding serfs and slaves, Jewish landowners were no exception. Moreover, in their role as international traders in various merchandise, the Jews, like the Arabs in Africa, included slaves among that merchandise. As the Germanic peoples of Western Europe invaded the Slavic lands to the east, they often sold members of the conquered population as slaves to Jews, who then resold them elsewhere in the Christian or Islamic world. Jews became major dealers in the European slave trade, as in other trade. The growing spread of Christianity in Europe and its influence on secular law increasingly made it illegal for Jews to own Christian slaves, and also increasingly difficult for them to own land. Christians, Jews, and Muslims all banned the holding of their own people as slaves, but all three held other peoples as slaves. In the Ottoman Empire, Jews continued to function as slave traders for centuries, selling European Christians to Muslims. With castration being forbidden to Muslims, Jews were the principal suppliers of white eunuchs to the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, the supply coming largely from the Caucasus region.
So there again, you can hear Thomas Sowell making the case that all three religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, were involved in the slave trade in Europe. They were all trading each other. Christians were not alone in their mistreatment of other religions. Jews were slaves, Christians were slaves, Muslims were slaves, and they all sold each other as slaves. And so history is just messy. And it's messy because humans are sinful. There was no one group that were the sinners, and everyone else was just very pure and not sinning. If we look deeper at history, beyond the memes, beyond, the one sentence little conversations on social media, I think we would come to understand the fuller picture and the complexities of our relationships between Christians and Jewish people. We would see that some Christians did terrible things to some Jewish people, but we would also see that there were some Jewish people who also did and said horrible things about Christians. There's enough sin to go around. History provides important perspective on reality far more than internet memes or one-sided conversations can provide. I want to take a quick time out here to let you know that the Center for Biblical Unity book clubs are coming soon. They're going to be starting the week of March 17th. And I want to make sure that you come check out how you can get connected to book clubs, see what we're reading, and encourage you to join and maybe make some new friends. All you have to do is go to centerforbiblicalunity.com. That's our main website. You're going to scroll down on the homepage, and then you're going to see a big button that says Virtual Book Clubs. And you're going to click on that button, and it's going to take you right to the page. You'll be able to scroll down and see what books we're reading. We're going to be reading Natasha Crane's new book, When Culture Hates You. We're going to have another group going through our book, Walking in Unity. Our friend Arnold Huntley is going to be leading that group. And finally, our third group is Monique will be leading conversations on the queering of the American child. So if you want to find out meeting times and costs and all that good information, just go to centerforbiblicalunity.com/book clubs. Okay, I've been watching the chat. I don't see any unanswered questions, so I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with the last section of the teaching. But if you want to put questions in the chat, I will check one more time before I sign off. Now, like I said in the previous teaching, there are some ways that I think the discussion about anti-Semitism in 2025 overlaps with a lot of the conversations Monique and I had about race and racism in 2020. And there are situations where the term racism has become so broad and so subjective that what behaviors actually qualify as racism have become very confusing. And it got to the point where we felt like everything was racist. You know, hiking was racist, swimming was racist, firing a black person from their job was racist, and so on. And so much so that I think a lot of people have even stopped caring if you call them a racist, because the term has sort of lost its emotional punch, if you will. Well, some people are kind of feeling a similar kind of way about the word anti-Semitism, that it's losing its meaning, and that it is sometimes vague in identifying what behaviors exactly qualify as being anti-Semitic, and is it an attitude? What is it exactly that qualifies? Now, we've spent a lot of time last time and in the section with Callie just now, and how the Jewish community understands the term anti-Semitic. But I am going to try to propose an alternative, and to help us think about the term in a more biblical fashion, and trying to get out of sociology a little bit and get more of a position about it based on the Bible. And so in this next section, I'm going to try to offer a more biblically based definition of anti-Semitism. And this is from the work that I did in the book Walking in Unity. And so, Bob, I'm skipping down to page 32. So in my opinion, what we call racism and what we call anti-Semitism is some combination, biblically speaking, of the following four sins. So the first one is what Monique and I call unjust ethnic partiality. This is the sin of favoritism toward a group, and you can advantage a certain group or disadvantage a certain group based on their ethnicity. And just as God wants his people to follow the same standards and implement equal weights and measures and equal standards, we would say that unjust ethnic partiality is a sin. However, that's not to say that all ethnic preferences are sinful. Some people, because ethnicity is very close to culture sometimes we might have an inclination toward wanting to preserve a particular culture, or we like hanging out with people who speak our same language, or and we have shared culture with. And I don't think that that preference is inherently sinful. What it becomes sinful is when there are unequal standards applied in particular situations, such as in a justice situation, in a law court situation. We don't give preferences based on ethnicity. The second sin that I think is connected to the issue of anti-Semitism or racism would be storing up hatred in our heart simply because of someone's ethnicity or nationality. We, as God's people, are to be known by love. And if we just hate and we have hatred in our hearts toward a brother or sister or anyone, simply because of their ethnicity or nationality, I would say that's a sin. And so that's something to look out for. And again, these can be some combination. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have all four of these sins in order for it to be a sin, but some combination of that. Okay, let's go on to the third issue is dehumanizing words toward a group based on their ethnicity. God's word in James chapter 3 talks about the fact that we shouldn't speak verbal curses over our fellow human beings because they're created in the image of God. And so I would say that using slurs or telling sinful jokes about people based on their melanin or their ethnicity violates their dignity. And finally, I would look at the issue of ethnic idolatry. Now, this is one I did not include in Walking in Unity. I wish I had. If I ever get a chance to revise the chapter, I would add this. But ethnic idolatry is seeing our ethnicity as being part of our core identity, seeing my ethnicity as inherently superior to others, and seeing other ethnicities as inherently inferior. Now, again, sometimes ethnicity is very closely aligned with culture. And what I don't want to be understood as saying is that I'm not suggesting that all religions are equal or that all worldviews are equal. No, I think that there are some, Christianity is the one true religion, and not all worldviews are equal. Some are better than others, okay? It's whatever worldview comes more in conformity with God's standard of justice. But when we're talking about ethnic idolatry, we're talking about making our ethnicity such a core part of our identity that we think that we are better than other ethnicities because of who we are in our ethnic group. And so again, I think that what I'm trying to lay out here is a biblical way of thinking about what we call in our culture racism or anti-Semitism. It is some combination of these four sins. And to me, I would prefer to try to use more specific biblical terms like sin and hatred and bitterness and idolatry than to use vague, sociologically defined terms like racism or anti-Semitism. But that's just me. That's just how I think about things. And I do think that there's still value in understanding some of the historical context for terms like racism and anti-Semitism and some of the historical realities and the community thought behind those ideas. And I realize that some people may totally disagree with me on this issue, and that's fine. I'm just trying to think about how can we talk about these issues in a more using more biblical terminology, because when we run out to the culture and get these very loaded terms like anti-Semitism and then we want to bring them in the church and say that nobody can disagree with us, I'm not sure how helpful that is. But that's just me. You're free to try on the idea, pray about it, reject it, modify it, do whatever. This is just how I think about it. So now how might we apply these biblical principles to the issue of Jewish hate? I want to end this teaching today by offering some very practical examples to help illustrate where I think problems with ethnic partiality against Jewish people may or may not be in play. So, like, some things are very easy. Things like killing Jews simply because they're Jews, that's obviously sinful. Rounding up Jews and putting them in camps simply because they're Jews, sinful, okay? Burning down or defacing Jewish houses of worship in order to intimidate them or kill them, again, sinful. Saying things like all Jews are dirty or all Jews are parasites, I would say that's sinful. In these scenarios, Jewish people are specifically targeted because of their ethnicity and treated in what I would say are clearly unbiblical and dehumanizing ways. People who name the name of Jesus and engage in these kinds of gross acts of violence and aggressive speech against Jewish people. At best, I think they need to engage in some radical repentance. And I think it's also quite likely that they are not truly of us. They are not actually real Christians, because there is no precedent for this behavior among God's people in the New Testament. But let me also be clear that Christians can also be targeted by Jews. There can be hatred on both sides. Because again, all humans are sinful. And as Monique and I have said consistently since 2020, that all ethnic groups are vulnerable to targeting other ethnic groups and engaging in ethnic partiality. Unrighteous Jews are not exempt from ethnically or religiously targeting other people, including Christians. Okay, let's talk about a few more examples. I would say that from a biblical perspective, I don't think that Christians can accept the idea that telling Jews that and sharing their faith with Jews and then their need to embrace Jesus as a Messiah, just like every other sinner on the planet needs Jesus as their Savior. I don't think we can go along with the idea that that is Jewish hate. Explaining that Jesus is the long-awaited Jewish Messiah is just Christianity 101. It's Matthew 28, 19, and 20. It's Acts 1, 8. There is nothing more Jewish than embracing Jesus as the Messiah. And we will discuss more about that theme next week on the show. Another example. Some have asked, is criticizing the policies and the practices of the modern state of Israel, is that a sin? Is that Jewish hate? And I would say, I don't think it's automatically the case that it's Jewish hate. It might be, but it also might not be. For example, if the U.S. were to engage in unjust policies, it's not sinful to call out the reality that our government is supporting things like abortion or child castration and redefining marriage. It's not sinful or un-American to call out things that clearly violate God's justice standards. Likewise, I would say if Israel were to engage in unjust policies according to biblical standards, maybe even like the ones I just mentioned, it's not sinful or an expression of Jewish hate to call that out. We should, as Christians, call stuff like that out no matter what nation we're talking about. If there are clear, unjust policies according to biblical standards, we should call that out because our allegiance is to God's kingdom first. However, we also have to have the biblical standard of establishing facts and truth with evidence. We have to make sure something is true. We can't just jump behind a microphone or get on social media and start screaming that Israel is engaging in genocide without having some pretty clearly stated definitions and some rigorous fact checking. We can't be going by internet rumors and memes and that sort of a thing. Christians must judge the policies of any nation according to God's law, not national loyalty, no matter how much we may love our country. And so I don't think it's an expression of Jewish hate or a sin to ask thoughtful questions or to question any nations, including Israel's policies, when they clearly violate God's standards of justice. I also don't think it's automatically sinful to criticize specific Jewish individuals and institutions when they engage in unjust and barbaric practices that violate God's law. Just as I don't think it's inherently anti-Christian for a non-Christian to make a fair observation about a corrupt Christian leader. That's not Christian phobic or anything like that. I don't think it's automatically an example of Jewish hate to make an observation about genuine corruption by a Jewish person, such as George Soros. I don't think that is a Jewish hate or sinful situation. Now, again, there has to be a high standard of truth. We need research. We need evidence. We need to make sure that our facts are in order to verify our claims. But I don't think that calling out when claims can be substantiated, if the person is Jewish, I don't think that's automatically an expression of Jewish hate to call that person out. Now, I do think it would be sinful to hold every Jewish person responsible for the decisions or actions of the Israeli government or the Israeli army, or just making blatant statements like, it's all the Jews, okay? I think it's problematic to say things like all Jewish people. When you have a phrase that starts like that, all Jewish people, we're probably already in the land of the hasty generalization. That's an informal fallacy. So if we say things like, or we find ourselves saying things like, all Jewish people got into places of power or influence simply by cheating or defrauding others, or all Jews are parasites. These are broad generalities. They're unhelpful. They're untrue. And it would be just as untrue as saying things about all white people or all black people. Like, this is not good reasoning. Again, it's the fallacy of the hasty generalization. We shouldn't be doing this. From a biblical perspective, I would say that assuming something about an entire group of people is a sin. I don't think it's a crime, but it's a sin. Whereas I would say that acting violently against a Jewish person is probably a crime. I I'm a skeptic that it ought to be labeled as a special sin, like, or a special crime. Um, I'm a little bit undecided. I'm a little bit skeptical of having these hate speech laws or hate crime laws where we have special extra punishments for particular protected groups. I just think if somebody acts violently toward another human being, it should equal weights and measures. It should be the same punishment. But that's me. But yeah, I'm just not sure. I'm not convinced that because an act or a crime is motivated by ethnic or religious hate, that it should have a different level of punishment. I could be persuaded on that. It just, for me, I don't see the biblical case for that. I think murder is murder and hate is hate. So, but yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a skeptic about hate speech and hate crimes. Anyways, all of that to say, if you find yourself constantly saying things like the Jews or all the Jews, I want to encourage you to check in with the Holy Spirit about that, to have him help reveal the condition of your heart. You may need to reflect on whether there is even hatred in your heart that you need to work on before the Lord and go through a process of repentance. There might be a feeling or thoughts that you're harboring in your heart of unjust partiality, disfavoring Jews as a group because of certain beliefs that you've had about them, rather than looking at the character of individuals or seeing your Jewish friends and family as a mission field and not a cultural enemy. And finally, I want to say that I also think it would be a sin to blame Jews today for the sins of their ancestors in putting Jesus to death on the cross. Just as many white people don't see a biblical case for being judged for the sins of white people in past generations, I would say we do not want to put that on Jews today. Their ancestors made those decisions about putting and cooperating with the Romans and putting Jesus to death. But today, how we want to think about our Jewish friends and family is that they are a mission field. They are people who need the gospel. And we know that even according to Paul's words in Romans chapter 11, God has a plan. He has a plan to bring revival to the Jewish people so that they will embrace Jesus as the Messiah. And there are more Jews today who are Christians on the planet Earth now than at any time in church history. And that's a good thing. The Jewish people have not been abandoned by God without hope. They are not a cursed people. They are a people who need to find Jesus as their Messiah, just like any other people. Let me close with this thought. I know we're a little over time, but here's my final thought is that the global Jewish population is estimated to be about 14 million right now on the planet Earth. And that represents 0.2% of the world's population, according to Pew Research from a few years ago. Most of them live in Israel and America. The vast majority of that, 0.2% of the world's population that are Jews, they live in Israel or America. And yet, isn't it interesting that Jews wield incredible influence in so many sectors of society? The film industry, the music industry, banking, politics. Two of the biggest conservative voices right now in our country are Jewish men, Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager. But keep in mind that not all Jews are religious. Many Jews are simply ethnic Jews. They're secular. They're atheists sometimes. They are not motivated by their religion whatsoever. Being a Jew is sort of like having a suitcase, and that brings with it culture and an ethnicity and sometimes a religion. And not everyone is the same. But they are a people who have often had great success and ascend to places of great influence. And this is why I think that they are often so hated, because they are a tiny fraction of the world population, and yet there is something about their culture that teaches their children to preserve their culture and to position themselves in places of influence. Here's a 1-minute summary of the issue from Thomas Sowell.
Where does the hatred for the Jews come from in history?
Number of places, but they are people who have succeeded an awful lot in the midst of other people who have not. Years ago, one official of one of the Jewish organizations in New York asked me, what can Jews themselves do in order to minimize the hostility they face? And I gave him a one-word answer: fail. Because as long as you succeed, you're going to be hated.
So the source is success.
It's not only the
hatred.
success, it's the success starting in poverty, as the Jews did in the United States and in many other countries. And so you not only see them succeed, you see them rise up from the bottom, past other people. The people they've passed don't like it. But there's also the fact that the role they play economically has never been understood. They're middlemen or they're money lenders, and the argument is they really aren't producing anything. You can't see anything tangible that they don't stand at a production line turning out widgets.
Where does the hatred for the Jews come from?
But what they do, instead of turning out widgets, is they are very influential in the realm of ideas. And that is what they turn out. So what is a Christian to do? I would say 2 things. First, preach the gospel. I did an entire video about this in the fall of 2023. You can go back and check that out, explaining our unique relationship with the Jewish people. Second, I would say, is make sure that you are judging fairly. It says in Leviticus chapter 19 that we are to not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but rather judge your neighbor fairly. And this would include your Jewish neighbor. Jesus reiterates this in Matthew chapter 7 in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Don't judge, or you will be judged, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." To engage in hypocrisy is to use unequal weights and measures, is to judge unfairly. And finally, in John chapter 7, Jesus says this. He says, "Stop judging by mere appearances." I'm going to say maybe consider stop judging by internet rumors, by memes, but instead judge correctly, judge accurately, judge fairly. How do I want to be judged? I want people to judge me fair, judge rightly, judge the way I would want to be judged, judge according to evidence, judge according to reality, not internet rumors. Judge according to God's standards, not human standards. Don't judge someone's outer appearance merely on its own or how they dress. Judge people according to their heart posture and their standing before God. I'm going to put a bookmark there for now. I hope you have found this discussion helpful. I know it might seem a bit pedantic to spend an entire hour thinking about, well, really 2 hours, how to define anti-Semitism. But let me tell you, it's a big issue right now. There is a ton of confusion over this issue in the public square. I hope you have found this helpful. Next week, we are going to have a very, very special guest on the show. Dr. Golan Broshi from the One for Israel Ministry is going to be on the show, and we will be continuing this discussion about anti-Semitism. Dr. Broshi is a Jewish scholar. He's also a Messianic Jew, and he specializes in Talmudic Judaism. And he's going to be here to help us continue to clarify the differences between Christianity and Judaism. And as part of this discussion, we will be addressing some of those internet rumors about what the Talmud actually says about Christians. Does the Talmud teach Jewish people to hate Christians? That's what we see on social media these days. Is it true? I know that this conversation is going to bless you. Please don't miss it. Make sure to share this show. I really appreciate your support. Have a good week and God bless.